All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fiveable study session for AP Euro. So as far as that goes, let's go ahead and talk about the Marshall Plan, okay? Now, the thing is, the Marshall Plan, what we want to talk about here is, remember, after World War II, then we start to get into the Cold War era. And what happens here, now, for example, we probably need to, we need to see a few things, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork before we go into any of this. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at some things here. Now, first of all, we want to look at the Eastern Bloc. Okay, so when we look at the Eastern Bloc, this is, these are countries in Eastern Europe that were not part of the Soviet Union. Okay, that's what you want to understand, that these countries were not part of the Soviet Union. That you see that there are, of course, Belarus, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These were part of the Soviet Union. But then you've got Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. Now, Yugoslavia ends up becoming an independent communist dictatorship, independent of the Soviet Union. But as far as this goes, this is the sphere of influence that Stalin asked for at the end of World War II. He said that basically, Germany had attacked Russia twice and in the 20th century, and Stalin says, we are looking for this as a sphere of influence. Now, what ends up happening, and Winston Churchill brought this up in 1945-46, he gave a speech at a commencement in Missouri, Harry Truman's home state of Missouri, who was president of the United States at the time. And Winston Churchill said, an iron curtain has descended across Europe. So what's becoming evident here is that all of these countries within the Soviet sphere of influence, that there are puppet governments being installed that are, sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And so as far as that goes, that Stalin is not allowing free governments to function in these areas. And so the policy, what is the fear that a lot of people have, is that we are going to be in a situation where perhaps there's going to be Soviet aggression, that perhaps the Soviets are not going to be content with Eastern Europe, that, you could see here, they could very easily move into Austria, Germany, West Germany, Italy. And this is something that's, that's got a lot of people wondering. Now, so then we go to the Marshall Plan, okay? So the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program. Now, this is something, and this actually came up as an LEQ last year on the AP Euro exam, about the relationship between Europe and the United States after World War I and after World War II. And so as far as that goes, the Marshall Plan was, was a foreign aid plan. Okay, so basically the United States is giving money to European countries to help their economies recover, because the United States really is coming out of World War II as really the only country, the only major power, if you think about it, that is untouched, okay? Because everyone else had been bombed, everyone else had lost, lots of lives. The United States, we only lost about 400,000 men in World War II. You compare that to several million for the Soviets, and of course, plenty in every European country as well. And so the United States was in a situation where they were looking to the United States for leadership. And the Marshall Plan is really about, giving money to these countries to rebuild in hopes that they're not going to fall to communism. Now, France, for example, had a very viable communist party. A lot of the people in the French resistance were communists. After the war, there were a lot of communists in France, and people were afraid that communism could spread into Europe. So this containment policy is what the Marshall Plan is promoting. And this is kind of the good cop side, that we're throwing money at all of these European countries from the United States. And really, this is only about 100 billion in 218 US dollars. Now only 100 billion, but in terms of government investment, it's really not that much. Like, there were some people who were skeptical in the United States about the Marshall Plan, and Marshall was like, look, compared to what it was costing us to be at war, this is really very, very little. And the United States government thought that this was a worthwhile investment, because if the European countries, Western and Central European countries, could rebuild, then they're not going to become communist. They're going to be thankful to the United States, and they can be counted on to be allies of the United States. But note here that this is a period where the United States is, first of all, for the first time, exercising global leadership against communism. All right, so as far as that goes, yes, that was the Marshall Plan, and it was effective. Like, containment was very effective in Europe. Like, there's no European country that was not communist in 1945 that became communist. So I would say that that was a very successful effort on the part of the United States. OMG, Ashley, hi. All right, what was the main cause of the Bay of Pigs? Now, Sonia, I would ask if you are lost. I do the A-Push review at 7 p.m. on Wednesday nights. Remember that 5able reviews, we've got AP US History Wednesdays at 7 and AP European History Wednesdays at 9. Okay, so but if you'll come in sometime and ask that during the US History one, then that will be just fine. But yeah, I would not imagine that the Bay of Pigs would be on the AP Euro exam. So you can, if you were studying that, you can be a little bit relieved, because nope, you don't have to study that. Okay, and so what were the revolutions of 1968, and did they accomplish anything? Okay, now as far as that goes, there are a few things that are going on. Now, 1968 was a very volatile year, no matter where you were. In the United States, 1968 was important because you had the assassination of Martin Luther King, a lot of riots that broke out following that. Also, you had the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, and of course, protests against the Vietnam War. So in the United States, 1968 was a very volatile time. It was also a very volatile time in Western Europe. There were, in 1968, protests in France. Okay, yeah, when I look up 1968 protests, France is what comes up first when I Google it. Of course, there's a lot of stuff in the United States too. I'll show you. All right, so as far as that goes, okay, so 1968 protests, France. Okay, so France had, May of 1968, and so we have, a period of civil unrest, which there they are building, with their barricades and all of that. Now, notice, wow, a lot of like student desks and stuff like that. But as far as that, now we have right now in France the Yellow Vest protest, which you see some things going on there. But a series of student protests against capitalism, consumerism, American imperialism. That's one thing about France as well, that the French were, very suspect of American influence, not only of communism, but American influence. And so we see here student occupations, yada yada yada. So May of '68 affected French society for decades afterwards. Is considered this day as a cultural, social, and moral turning point in the history of the country. So the movement succeeded as a social revolution, not as a political one. Okay, and also the Gaullist Party emerged stronger than ever before. Okay, now the Gaullist Party, this was the center-right party. Okay, so this was a center-right party that was Charles de Gaulle's party. Okay, so this is, on one side, and that really kind of brings you into really what brings you into as far as the French, the polarization of French society, where you have the more like traditionalist Catholic France versus a more like progressive socialist leaning France. And so as far as that, France experienced 1968 student protests. Now, also, you want to note the Prague Spring, okay? So in the Eastern Bloc, there were also some things happening here. And so what happened that in Czechoslovakia, they elected a reformer as the first secretary of the Communist Party. And so, you know, for most of 1968, they were trying, you know, this guy was trying to reform. Now, you don't necessarily have to know this guy's name, but he was somebody who was leading Czechoslovakia, and he was trying to bring about reforms. Okay, he called this socialism with a human face, lifted censorship on the media, liberalized Czechoslovak society. Now, this is something that we want to note here, is that when we think about the Prague Spring, we also want to note the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, so the Brezhnev Doctrine was basically articulated after the Prague Spring in order to justify what had happened, okay, in the Prague Spring, like when the Soviets had come in. And so basically the Brezhnev Doctrine reads, when forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist country toward capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and concern of all socialist countries. So if you think like that the Western strategy here is to contain communism, to keep communism from spreading, that the Soviet Union is determined to make sure that communism does not, that a country in the communist bloc doesn't cease to be communist. Okay, and so as far as that goes, that's something that we see here, that the Soviets, now it's not until Gorbachev that the Brezhnev Doctrine is lifted. Okay, it's not until Gorbachev that the Brezhnev Doctrine is lifted, that he says that we're not going to do that. And then, of course, that's what leads to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the election of liberalizing democratic governments in the former Eastern Bloc. Okay, so as far as that goes, we've got another question answered. All right. And how did World War II and post-World War II factors? Okay, so as far as that, Gilda, that World War II and post-World War II factors. Now, the thing is that when we look at the whole Eastern Bloc, that it was, you think about it, why is Stalin getting all of these, why are the US and the UK saying, you know what, go ahead, do whatever you're going to do over there? Because, Stalin and the US and Britain, they had been allies. So if we think about the Yalta Conference, okay, so let me run over to the Yalta Conference here. All right, and so this is something that could very well end up on, be exam material. So let's think about the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference was a conference that was convened between the big three. Okay, so you see that there is, there's Stalin, there's Churchill, and there's FDR at Yalta. Okay, so basically what they were doing here at the Yalta Conference is they are getting together in order to discuss what are we going to do with Germany. By this time, it's pretty much a given that Germany is going to be defeated. So how are we going to go in? How are we going to divide it up? So they decide that they are all going to split, they're going to split Germany into occupied zones. Okay, and so one of the things here is, now this is also where they decide to create the United Nations. Okay, so everybody's going to, as far as the United Nations is is a creature of the Yalta Conference. Okay, so the Soviets say that we're going to join the United Nations. All right, that there's going to be this international organization created, and they're going to everybody's going to join it. All right. All right, so the Yalta Conference. But anyway, and then they're going to divide Germany. Now, let me go ahead and pull up occupied Germany. Okay, so Allied, occupied Germany. And so this is what they decide at the Yalta Conference, that they are going to they're going to basically divide it into zones of occupation. Now, what you see here is that the Soviets have a sector, the British and the French have a sector. Now, the French have a sector that is really oddly shaped, and this is because the United States and the British wanted the French to have a sector, and the Soviets are like, you know, Stalin's just like, the French were defeated. Like, we're not giving the French, we're not cutting this into fourths. And so what Stalin says essentially is, we're cutting this into thirds. And if you want France to have a sector, then it's going to have to come out of your end. And so the United States and Britain both, you know, gave France a sector of their agreed upon occupied Germany. And so that's why we've got that. And then notice that Berlin, okay, so Berlin is in the Soviet sector. So that's where, you know, even so, not only is Germany going to be divided up between zones of occupation, but then Berlin is also going to be divided up. And so the Allies, you see there's an American, a British, and a French sector of Berlin, which is right in the middle of Soviet-occupied East Germany. And that's where you get the, you know, the Berlin blockade, okay? So Wikipedia's just got great maps. Again, there's nothing wrong with Wikipedia, ladies and gentlemen. It's really, you know, I mean, the thing is that it's vetted by scholars. It has great maps. And so what happens here is Stalin in 1948 decides that he's going to put a blockade on, you know, things that are coming in. Okay, so basically there was a rail line going to West Berlin, and Stalin decides he's going to cut it off. Now, what Stalin's trying to do here is he's trying to get the Western Allies to just cede West Berlin, okay, because that was part of the World War II agreement. So when we think about World War II affecting this, that the zones of occupied Germany are very much affected by this. And so what happens is the Berlin Airlift, and for about 11 months, the Allies supplied West Germany, like everything from, you know, they've got to have like milk, bread, meat, you know, anything to eat, any of their consumer goods. They are being flown in on planes on round-the-clock flights. You see that they're coming from these places here, and then they are all flying back here. I mean, this is just round-the-clock, 24/7 planes coming into West Berlin. And finally, Stalin, you know, Stalin relents, but the battle lines are kind of hardening here, okay? And so when you look at basically West Germany, now this is what happens eventually is that in 1949, the French, the British, and the Americans decide, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and, you know, give West Germany its independence. Now, there were still a lot of American troops over there occupying, but it's not just occupied sectors, okay? So basically what happens here is that West Germany and West Berlin, okay? So they're going to be, you know, they're going to, basically, you know, you've got two countries here, and eventually East Germany, okay? So East Germany is eventually created as well, okay? So that's, again, in 1949. And so East Germany is, of course, you know, all of East Germany except for West Berlin. All right, and so with that, that's how World War II is affecting this, because of occupied Germany. And you think of the Berlin Wall. That was, you know, during Khrushchev's tenure. They, in the early 1960s, the Soviets put a wall around West Berlin so that people couldn't cross over between East and West Berlin. That it was, you know, throughout the 1950s, it was just, you could just walk across these sectors, and it wasn't that hard to go from East to West Berlin, which of course resulted in people going into West Berlin and then just kind of disappearing into democracy. And so with that, that would be how World War II and the post-World War II settlements, okay? And with that, now remember, any questions need to be asked as questions. Okay, so make sure that you're asking questions as questions. All right, so Zachary, again, the Korean War. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, that I've got U.S. history. That I do U.S. history at 7 o'clock on 7 o'clock on Wednesdays. European history at 9 o'clock. So with this, the Korean War would be another thing that would be a U.S. history topic, but I've never seen anything about the Korean War there. All right, so again, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's another one that's really just, I've never seen anything about the Cuban Missile Crisis on the exam, because that's basically between the United States and the Soviets. That doesn't bring into account, I mean, that's not something that I would think would be likely to come up on a European history exam. All right. So as far as that goes, all right. So yes, we do want to talk about now. Some of y'all, I don't. Zachary, are you taking AP US History or AP Euro? I'm a little bit confused here. Okay, because remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is the AP Euro. This is the AP Euro Q&A. So there are things like when we talk about the Cold War. There's the Cold War in general, but there are aspects of the Cold War that are going to be on the APUSH exam, and then aspects of the Cold War that'll be more likely to be on the AP Euro exam. So make sure, now, of course, there's a lot of overlap as well, but when we're talking about things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, these are things that are really much more related to U.S. history than to a course in European history. All right, so as far as that, Teresa, the concept of mutually assured destruction, all right, that's something that during the Cold War, this idea that, okay, the Soviets, once they have nuclear weapons, how are we going to how are we going to respond to that, to the Soviets having nuclear weapons? And what happens is, like, well, in the 1950s, you think, well, we make more nuclear weapons. And we both make so many nuclear weapons that it's obvious that if anyone launches a nuclear weapon, then what we're going to be looking at is that everybody's going to be destroyed. So the concept of mutually assured destruction. Now, the thing is, we do want to talk about the alliances, okay, which, remember that the alliance system is often mentioned as a causal factor for World War I, but alliances really aren't inherently bad. In fact, in a lot of cases, alliances can be good. I mean, alliance systems work until they don't. Where alliance systems don't work is when someone actually attacks a member of an alliance, and that causes a very big war, okay? But the thing is that the United States is providing, after World War II, unprecedented global leadership. And so what we want to note here are these Cold War era alliances, okay? So NATO, which was organized by the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All right, so in 1949, NATO included included a handful of Eastern European countries. Now you see that Greece and Turkey have been invited into NATO. Then West Germany in, out, looks like they're in again. And so you see here that most, and then Spain. Now another thing is, during the Cold War, Spain had been marginalized. Now Francisco Franco was not a fascist; he was a conservative authoritarian, but he had been allied with the fascists. So definitely, right after World War II, Franco's Spain was marginalized, was kind of a pariah in Europe. But since Franco was anti-communist, this is something that once the Cold War is heating up, then people were more, European countries were, a bit less cold to Franco, because if we're allies against communism, then there you go. So you can see here, if you look at Spain, so we see, West Germany. I don't know why they're in, out, in like that. I don't know if that's a mistake. But yeah, so finally you see 1982 that Spain is allowed into, into NATO. And so that's something. Now that might have been at the end of Franco's dictatorship. Let me see that. Okay, so yeah, he was, okay, so Franco, Spain was never allowed into NATO. It looks like, wow, so let's see. It was regime. So let's see. So Spain joined the United Nations in 1955. During the Cold War, Franco was one of the world's foremost anti-communist figures. His regime His regime was assisted by the West and was asked to join NATO. So it looks like that it was something that. Okay, so that's something there. Okay, so actually, they were invited to join NATO before they actually did. So Franco never actually joined NATO, but you can see that Franco as Spain got a good deal of acceptance because of his firmly anti-communist stances. And so as far as that goes, then let's just take a look here. So that's NATO. Now, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we've seen the expansion of NATO, where you see a lot of Eastern Bloc countries. Pretty much every country that was part of the Eastern Bloc is today part of NATO. And then even Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been part of the Soviet Union, were brought into NATO. And then, so NATO was 1949. So this is something that happens in the midst of the Berlin blockade. All right, so Stalin's Berlin blockade is basically hardening the lines between the Western powers and the Soviet world. Okay, so as far as that, the Warsaw Pact. Okay, so the Warsaw Pact was a response to NATO, and this was formed in 1955. Now, the United Nations is an international organization. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a mutual defense pact. It is a military alliance. An attack on any one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members. Okay, so to attack Latvia, for example, that is an attack on the United States. And so the Warsaw Pact was formed in order to counter NATO and just to send another message out there. So this is a good map here of the Cold War era alliances. Okay, now maybe that other let's see. So NATO members by year. I'm just kind of curious about this. All right. So yeah, Spain, it says 1982. Okay. So in the order joining NATO. So Spain and so I don't know, whoever did this map might have been a little bit confused. Okay. But we see here that, you see NATO and of course the Warsaw Pact here. All right. And so as far as that goes, you're looking at the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc forming the Warsaw Pact. Now, there's never a war in Europe. That's why it's called the Cold War. But basically, this is what you're looking at, that Europe during the Cold War is in this kind of stalemate between the communist aligned countries and against the, versus the Western democracies. Okay, so with that, that's kind of going into the Warsaw Pact and NATO. All right, so then, can we review the reforms implemented by Gorbachev? Okay, yes, definitely, and this is very good AP Euro stuff. Okay, so when we're thinking about, these reforms that are led by Gorbachev. Let me think about where I was talking about this recently. There was somewhere very recently that I was addressing this, and I'm trying to think about when I did that. Okay, just real quick here. Let me just run into my drive because I think I've got something here. What we've got here, we've got the maps of occupied Germany, all of that kind of stuff. Now, as far as that goes, let's take a look at the different Soviet leaders, okay? So first of all, Nikita Khrushchev, okay? So Stalin's successor. Stalin, what he did here, what Khrushchev was responsible for was a program of de-Stalinization. Now, decolonization was, of course, something that happened after World War II, but de-Stalinization. So Khrushchev gave what is known as a secret speech to the Communist Party. Now, this wasn't, now the reason it's called the secret speech is because he did, in this private Communist Party higher-ups meeting, he did criticize Stalin. He criticized Stalin and said that Stalin had created a cult of personality that was really not, it was definitely not the socialist ideal to create this cult of personality with a single leader. And so Khrushchev said that we need less of a cult of personality. We need more collaborative leadership at the top. And also he began to phase out the Gulag system, the system of these camps that Stalin had created in the Soviet Union. So those begin to get phased out during Khrushchev's time. And also Khrushchev was a fan of, he was a proponent of what he called peaceful coexistence with Western democracies. So the previous kind of look, now remember that Lenin was about like advocating the overthrow of all Western of all of the capitalist countries. And the reason for that is he believed that capitalism would be a threat to the survival of socialism. Now, Stalin did what was called, socialism in one country. That Stalin made it the policy of the Soviet Union no longer to say that our policy is to overthrow other governments, is to advocate the overthrow of other governments. So let's focus on this. Now, Khrushchev was saying, like, look, we don't need to be in quite as much of a war footing as we were during Stalin's time. He believed that capitalism will eventually collapse under its own weight. And so therefore, the Soviet Union doesn't really need to do anything proactively to try to combat capitalism, okay? Because it's just something that is going to happen. And so there were times when he was prone to bombastic rhetoric. One of his most famous quotes was, "We will bury you." Now, that makes you instantly kind of have this idea of like a nuclear war or something like that. Stay hydrated, kids. And so with that, he's saying economically, okay, that the Soviet Union will bury the West economically. Now, also, there was one time where he like took off his shoe, I believe at the United Nations, and started beating it against the podium. And so he was very prone to like that kind of bombastic rhetoric. Now, his regime put down the Hungarian revolt. Now, I mentioned the Prague Spring already, but in 1956, there was the Hungarian revolt as well. Then now, of course, there is a question about Sputnik, and I think that I can actually answer two questions at once. Okay, so let me take a look here, because I think that, well, I thought that there was a question about Sputnik. Was I wrong here? Let's see. Okay, I could have sworn I saw something about Sputnik. But anyway, let's just go ahead and keep going through here, okay? And so Sputnik, now this was something that was a big scare to the United States because the Soviets were the first to put a man in space to orbit the Earth, and also the first to, excuse me, well, maybe not orbit. It was the first to, but anyway, they put the first man in space, okay? Now, then in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was the first satellite. And so the Soviets were winning the space race, and also the Berlin Wall was built during Khrushchev's tenure. And so as far as the Berlin Wall, somebody was asking about the Berlin Wall, so we'll start answering that. And so with that, the Berlin Wall was something that was necessary because before it was built, what you were looking at was that people could just walk across. And once somebody got into the American sector or the British sector or the French sector, then we're thinking in terms of that. Yeah, Sputnik, I guess, would be relevant to AP Euro because that is dealing with Soviet technology and stuff like that. So yeah, that would have been perfectly relevant. But the Berlin Wall was necessary. It was also very effective. Okay, that it was one of those things that, I mean, when you look at the Berlin Wall on one side, it is really, now I was in Berlin over the summer, got to see a few pieces of the Berlin Wall, but this is a photograph of the Berlin Wall at that time. Okay, so with that, we can see here that this was in 1986. Now, on one side in West Berlin, you can see here that you could just, I mean, a guy's just walking his dog right along the wall. There's a lot of graffiti on it. Now, on this side, you notice the wall is clean. The wall's just squeaky clean. Then you've got a military presence here. You have a fence there. So if you were trying to get over the wall, and some people did, and they were killed for it, you had to jump over this fence and run across, run across this and climb over the wall. And that was a very difficult thing to do, okay? And not a lot of people, I mean, I don't know if anybody did, got over it successfully. Did anyone successfully scale the Berlin Wall? That would be something interesting. Okay, so kind of curious here. Okay, so to prevent attempts, the wall was reinforced, barbed wire, spikes, metal gray. Okay, so escape attempts and victims of the inner German border. 10 great escapes across the Berlin Wall. Okay, so this is something that actually it looks like there might have actually been a few people. Let's see. So came down. The wall was a lethal barrier. Yada yada. Stole a tank. Okay, that's one way to do it, right? After it smashed into the Berlin Wall. Okay, so may have helped build the wall, but plotted his escape. The local, let's see. So I'm getting out of here to the west. Anyone who want to come along? Oh, it says the vehicle failed to break through the wall and got stuck on the barbed wire and was shot twice by East German border guards. Eventually, West Germans who had been drinking in a nearby bar came to his aid and helped him down from the barbed wire. Okay, so the thing is that there were a few people who got through. Those are some interesting escapes, but for the most part, for most people, it was a pretty impenetrable barrier, and I would say that it was effective for doing what it was, that it was designed to do. So as far as that goes, the Berlin Wall, I would say, was effective. Okay, this is interesting because I can do a few of these at once. Okay, so looking at these, going to Gorbachev. Okay, so I just wanted to go ahead and take you through all of the Soviet premiers because I think that that's a good thing to do here. Now, Leonid Brezhnev. Okay, so Brezhnev is between Khrushchev and Gorbachev, and Brezhnev, now his tenure was marked by economic stagnation, but that's pretty much going on in the West as well. The 1970s weren't a very good time for the global economy in general. Now, we've mentioned already the Prague Spring. So that the main thing you want to know about Brezhnev is the Brezhnev Doctrine, okay? That if any Eastern Bloc countries try to assert their independence, try to liberalize, try to have reforms for democracy and openness, that's going to become a matter of concern to all socialist countries. And that was, of course, a justification of the Soviet intervention in the Prague Spring. Okay, so as far as that goes, and let me go ahead and select every question that mentions Glasnost and Perestroika. Okay, so we've got something here. All right, so now let's go into Gorbachev's reforms. Okay, now Gorbachev, when he came to power, that he saw how weak the system was. Okay, everything was operating in secret, and the way Gorbachev could see it when he got to the top was the system was about to collapse on itself. That Gorbachev was trying to save it. Now, it's the type of thing that when he was on his way up, he was in the upper ranks of the Communist Party, and he still wasn't allowed to see the budget. Now, by comparison, if you wanted to see the United States budget, you could see it. It's posted. Now, of course, there are going to be some things you can't look at every line item on the CIA's budget, but you can look at the U.S. federal budget. It is public record that we have freedom of information in the United States. And the thing is that he believed, that Gorbachev believed, that for the socialist system to survive at all, that there would need to be some liberalizing reforms. Now, the reforms are Glasnost and Perestroika. Now, Glasnost means openness. Now, when I think Glasnost, I think Glasnost, okay? Glasnost. So that's where, when you look through glass, you can see it. And so basically that he encouraged open discussion and he encouraged criticism of the government because he felt like that there was a weakness. I mean, think about this. Any of you who are athletes or all of you here are studying for the AP exam. If your teacher just told you every time you wrote a DBQ or an LEQ, this looks great, there's nothing wrong with this, you would never improve. And so Gorbachev is trying to say that, look, I want people to criticize the system because when they criticize the system, then maybe we can see solutions. Now, the thing is, though, once this system was opened up to criticism, then the floodgates opened and it was really a lot more than it could handle. Now, then there was Perestroika. Now, the thing is, that's restructuring. And when you think about this, Stroika, structure, okay? So Glasnost, I can see through glass. Stroika, structure, okay? I'm restructuring. And so Gorbachev began restructuring Soviet enterprises and also started to admit to failures within the system because that had been Soviet policy for decades to not admit that anything was going wrong. And so Gorbachev believed that these were going to save the system, but at the same time, it really accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. And also, Gorbachev renounced the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, so once the Brezhnev Doctrine was renounced, then that led to, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the free elections in the former Eastern Bloc, and even the fall of the Soviet Union shortly after that. Okay, so that's something that hopefully that's something that y'all will find helpful. All right. And so in the sense that Rhea, I'm not sure what we're talking about here, okay? So, because the thing is that did the United States replace European powers during the process of decolonization? Now, decolonization is basically, letting go of colonies in Africa and Asia. Now, decolonization part one was, that was where we had, that Germany loses their colonies, that the Ottoman Empire loses its imperial possessions, and all that's left is Turkey. And then the British and the French govern these places as so-called mandates. Now, after World War II, the French and the British have to give up their colonies as well. Now, the British, lost India in the late 1940s. Excuse me, with just nonviolent resistance, and the British gave that up without a fight. The French were fighting to try to keep Algeria and to keep Indochina. Now, it was in 1960 that the UN made a declaration against colonialism, okay, against basically the idea that European, Western powers should rule over other countries. And this is a time, the United States granted independence to the Philippines, for example. Okay, so if we look at the Philippines, let's see. So the Philippines, let me just take a quick look there, became an independent country in, let's see. Okay, 1946. Okay, so the United States granted independence to the Philippines in 1946. So I would say that the United States didn't replace European powers. The United States is actually participating in decolonization. So I think that's what we want to note here, that the United States, as well as European powers, are giving up these colonies that they had ruled before World War II. All right, so as far as that goes, let's take a look here. All right, so because we do have a few people that are still on World War II and dictatorships, the major differences between fascist, Nazi Germany and communist Russia. Okay, so as far as that goes, that, really both of these, whether we're talking about Nazism, fascism, which of course are similar in a lot of ways, and, Soviet communism, in both cases, you're dealing with societies that are unfree. They don't have free democratic elections. They don't have the democratic process. They don't have, a market-driven economy. Now, of course, fascism is closer to that because there's private ownership of the means of production, but it's certainly, I wouldn't call like Nazi Germany a free market economy, okay? So as far as that goes, first of all, that when we look at the Soviets, we've got state ownership of the means of production, whereas in Nazi Germany, you had private ownership of the means of production, but highly regulated by the state, okay? That basically corporations would serve the needs of the state. There was a very tight alliance between the state and corporations. And so that's one aspect of that. Now, another thing is that when you look at fascism and Nazism, there is a social hierarchy, okay, that some people are superior to others as far as, ethnicities and stuff like that. Whereas for the Soviets, now, of course, they had a bureaucratic elite, but there was none of that, none of that racial theory. Now, of course, that wasn't really possible in the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had a lot of different races, and that really just wouldn't have worked. But when it comes down to it, we think about like right-wing socialism versus left-wing socialism. That right-wing is really, when somebody says, that I'm right-wing, there is a tolerance for some sort of social hierarchy or inequalities. Whereas somebody who is left-wing, they aren't, they're saying that we need to get rid of inequality. Somebody who's right-wing says that a certain amount of inequality is natural. That even if, that's not just to do with race or anything like that, but somebody who is right-wing would think that it's natural that some people are rich and some people are poor. Whereas somebody that's left-wing finds that situation unacceptable. So, fascism, Nazism, very nationalist as well. Now, Stalin during World War II appropriated nationalism in order to raise morale, but communism isn't by nature nationalist. Communism by nature is internationalist. And so with that, okay, so brief explanation. Yeah, Vietnam and Korean Wars, not so much. Okay, if we're thinking about AP European history, not so much. So as far as that, how could they come to power, actually compete? So Evelyn, the thing is that, the USSR did lose a lot of people, but they had a lot of people to lose. Now, the thing is, it's a good question. How could they compete with the United States during the Cold War period? The thing is, it's just a lot of it was shrouded in secrecy. For example, in the 1950s, JFK, who was getting ready to run for president, he talked about a missile gap. Okay, so there was this missile gap that was, that there was a belief in the United States, of course, with Sputnik as well. There was this belief in the United States that the Soviets had more missiles than we did. Actually, looking back, that was false. Okay, so the thing about the Soviet Union is that we just didn't have a lot of information. And that was something that was a limiting factor for the United States. But yes, when you look at the United States economy and the United States military, there really wasn't like a parity there between the United States and the Soviet Union. So yeah, part of that was that just the intelligence just was not there. That the Soviets really had a lot better intelligence apparatus than the Americans had. They knew a lot more about us than we knew about them. Part of that is, like I said, the U.S. budget is like public record. So it's easier to spy on a democracy than it is on a totalitarian state. And so going that, what are the key, let's see, so impact of the KGB. Sonia, the KGB is really like, more of an internal police organization. So you would want to know about that as far as, you wouldn't necessarily find them on a multiple choice question, but it's really more of like an internal secret police. So you'd want to think they're not really having an effect on the Cold War as much as that's part of the apparatus that the Soviet government is keeping up with with the way people are, what things people are doing in private. All right. And yeah, not quite sure about the causes of the Cold War, where that gets into that. But let's see. All right, taken in. So it's the end of the Cold War. So Détente, and that's something that we typically hear more about, like in U.S. history, than we do in European history. But Détente is kind of like in the 1960s, the late 1960s, 1970s, where you have a lessening of tensions. Okay, Détente is a French word for tension. Okay, so it's important to note that even though the Cold War, we can look at that as like 1945 to 1989, it's or 1991, depending on how you want to measure that, that it really was the 1940s and 50s and early 60s where it was really like the Cold War. Okay, like Ronald Reagan, for example, when he delivered his Evil Empire speech in the early 80s, he mentioned that he was talking about a time, something that happened like in the 1960s, where he said it was at the height of the Cold War. So when Reagan was talking in the 1980s, he was even talking about the Cold War as something that had happened in the past. So it is important to kind of note that, yeah, the tensions were heaviest in the 1940s and 1950s. All right. And so as far as that, that's really as far as the key factors of. Okay, yeah, we've basically gone over that like all evening tonight. So thanks for playing.